Designing Modern Board Games. And today, Lecture 24, How to Play Stalingrad, based on George Philly's book, Stalingrad for Beginners, now available on Smashwords.com and Amazon Kindle. To see the full game and all of its graphics, note the Stalingrad modules at zunsu.com and vassalengine.org. Much more on the game can be found at boardgamegeek.com. For a copy of the map and unit counters as redone with superior artwork, go to camelotgamestore.com. To buy the original game, which alas is out of print, seek out finer used board game dealers all across the world. Stalingrad is the archetypical hex and counter board war game. We start here with a hex, a hexagon. This is a typical hexagon. You see it right here. It's labeled, it's BB38. That's a grid coordinate. The letters run in one direction, the numbers run in a second, so that lines like this from bottom to top of the square all have the same letters, and lines from lower left to upper right all have the same number. The intersection of the two gives us the coordinate BB38. For historical reasons, while this is physically a hexagon, the individual hexagons in Stalingrad are called squares. Having looked at the hexagons, we now look at the unit counters. And we have here a Russian unit counter in bright red, and to its right a German unit counter in sort of pale gray. There is a bunch of information on each unit counter. The unit counters are descriptively named by the three numbers at the bottom. So the Russian unit is a 236. The German unit is a 444. What you see in front of you is a colored not quite square on the map board. Physically, the Stalingrad unit counters are little pieces of cardboard with printing on them. The printing, other than the 236, identifies the unit in various ways. Here we see some more German Ally unit counters. They're a pale green. The marking in the upper right-hand corner, that's actually a national flag, identifies the four unit counters. So the 334 is a Finnish unit. This 224 is a Romanian unit. The 336 is an Italian unit, and the 334 is a Hungarian unit. The German allies are printed in slightly different colors and given these additional markings to label them because there are rules for movement and placement of German allied units that are not quite the same as the rules for the movement and placement of regular German units. Let's consider some of the other information on the unit counters. In the upper left, on each unit counter, there is a shape. Units with the X are infantry. Units with the oval, it's said to resemble a tank tread, are armored corps. Units with the cross slash, like the 336, are cavalry. The superposition of the circle, the armored symbol, and the infantry symbol gives us motorized infantry. The units will sometimes be referred to in more detail because there's also a specific unit identifier on here. We have at the left, the Finnish Group 0. Next we have the German 57th Armored. We have an Italian. We have the 53rd Motorized Infantry, or PG. PG stands for Panzer Grenadier because all of these units were in fact German. So that's the main information on the unit counters. You will notice above each of these rectangular boxes here and here and here and here, above each of the rectangular boxes there's a little line of 3 X's. The line of 3 X's indicates that each of these units is a core. However, all the units in Stalingrad are core, and therefore the fact that these units are core has no real consequences for the play of the game. We now show a figure that identifies more precisely all of the information on each unit counter. After all, these are hex and counter games. A typical hex is J48 here. And what is the information on our counter? There's the unit size, it's a core. There's the unit type, the ellipse indicates that it's armored. The 3 numbers at the bottom, which are important for the play of the game, are the first number, which is the attack factor, the second number, which is the defense factor, and the third number, which is the unit's movement factor. The small numbers between the 2 white lines here, in this case the small number is 57, is the unit name or number. This is the 57th Armored Corps. The symbol above that, the plus sign here, indicates what nationality this unit is. The unit is German. Having said this, we now come to the question of how the game is played. If you're accustomed to a game like chess or checkers, you're accustomed to a game in which players take turns moving. They may each start with 16 units on the board, but when they take their turn in chess or checkers, you can only move one of those units. You may be able to move it through several squares, but you only move one unit on your turn. In Stalingrad, the play sequence is: each player has a turn. First the German player has a turn, then the Russian player has a turn. The 2 turns combined, one by each side, are a complete turn. A German turn followed by a Russian turn stands for 1 month of play of the game. During the complete turn sequence, first the German rolls for the weather for the turn, rolls a die to determine what the weather is, if we are in one of the months where he does this. He then examines the map board to see if the supply and isolation rules have allowed him to remove any Russian units from the map. If they have, the units are removed at this time. The German then moves any or all of his units subject to a whole bunch of rules on what he's allowed to do. The German, if he has moved his units next to Russian units, has created a situation where battles must occur, and the German player then executes the combat sequence to identify what the battles are and to determine the outcome of each battle. At this point, the German turn is over. There is a little movement right at the end of combat because there are advances and retreats after combat. The advances and retreats, as a result of combat, are made in accordance with the advance and retreat rules, which are slightly different from the movement rules. Once the German is truly done, it is the Russian player's turn. First, the Russian player removes any dead German units, any units that were eliminated by isolation, from the board. Then, having done that, the Russian player moves any or all of her units as she sees fit. If she creates battles because her units have been or are found to be next to German units, the battles are fought out. The combat is resolved. At the end of all this, 1 complete turn has passed. That's 1 month of game time. Mixed in with the movement section, there is the possibility that either or both players during their own turn will bring either replacements onto the board. They'll take dead units, units killed by combat or supply, and bring them back onto the map. There are also, for the German player, a small number of reinforcement units that are brought on. We'll get to those in a bit. We now come to the practical question, before we look at the fine details of play, of what the two players are trying to do. Each player has objectives, paths to victory. The Russian also has the negative objective. If she can deny the German his victory conditions, if she can keep the German from winning, the Russian wins automatically. The German player has two ways to win. First, if at the end of either player's turn there are no Russian units left on the board, the German automatically wins the game immediately. The German also wins if he captures the three cities Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad and leaves a unit counter on them continuously for the next three turns, the next two complete turns, I should say. If he succeeds in leaving his units in those three cities for two complete turns, he wins the game. In principle, both sides could be wiped out at the same time. That is actually not an issue. So let's look at more detail at the map board. We've already seen one example of a map issue, namely, a square with nothing on it is simply clear terrain. Here we see two squares that are tinged bright blue. This is a C square. It's impassable at all times. Here we have on the right C39, which is a lake square. The square is labeled because the lake freezes in midwinter, and when it freezes, units of both sides can move onto the square and out the far side. There are two squares in the far north that are in fact part of the Arctic Sea, but they freeze solid too in winter. However, the rest of the year we have a sea square and a lake square, and unless they have frozen, they are impassable. No unit may move on to them. We next look at a four line of squares. The four squares have in common that they are coast squares. That is, much of the terrain in each square is gray, showing there's land, but there is a little bit of blue here. That's water. So there is a boundary between land and water, and the boundary is a coast. Each of these squares also contains other terrain features. Square I-35 contains this black cross-hatched object. That's a railroad. Square J-34 has these extra blue lines in them. Those extra blue lines are a river. And square K33 has these beryl green to darker green leopard spots and darker lines that perhaps represent marsh grass. Square K33 is, in addition to being a coast square and a rail square because it has a railroad on it, is also a swamp square. You are now looking at a typical city. The little white boxes represent buildings as seen from directly above at great altitude. The city is identified by name. It's Kiev. There are two features of cities that are not instantly obvious. First, if you look carefully at the top, the upper left, or the bottom, there are dark gray lines in neighboring squares. Those dark gray lines are railroads. The railroads are continuous. They go into the city, even though you can't see them, and meet at the middle, so that a unit coming down from EE-22 by railroad could enter Kiev by railroad, and without interruption, assuming there were no enemy zones of control in the way, could roll out of the city again to the northwest, or to, that's northeast, isn't it? Or to EE-20, which is actually due west on the map. You are now looking at river squares. The rivers are marked by a darker blue center, lighter blue edges, and outside of the light blue edges, to sharpen up their image if there's printing going on, you'll notice a pair of near black lines. There's absolutely no doubt that O37 and P36 are river squares. The river comes in one side and chugs along and goes out the other. Here is a river end square. The river end square is HH17. Downhill and downstream from HH17 is the square here, JJ17. However, the represented river, the one that we put on the map, stops in HH17. The direction that the river end points matters. In this case, the river end is pointed at square HH16, which has consequences for combat. The river end could also have been poked over here. Now, having said there is the river end square, we might ask, well, are there other rules for rivers? Yes, there are a bunch involving combat. We'll get to those. I'm here just pointing out what the terrain feature is. We now reach some of the less pleasant, rough terrain. TT33, center of the image, is a mountain square. It contains various shades of brown, from pale brown to quite dark brown, and that represents the gradual increase in altitude and roughness of the terrain relative to the clear terrain square here. There's another sort of rough terrain. It's swamp. And this beryl green area is swamp and woods. The sort of splotches are trees. The darker blue is partly underwater. The very dark lines are to be interpreted as, gee, water surface, and those little things sticking up look like marsh grass, don't they? Yes, that's a swamp symbol. And here we see a rail square. EE17 has this dark hash mark flowing through it. The dark hash mark represents a line of rail travel. Here is the unique terrain feature. There's only one of them on the board. It's between Russia and the Crimea. This is the Straits of Azov, the Kerch Straits. The feature is we have land on PP22, we have land on PP23, but the hex edge between the two squares is entirely covered with water, so there's no land route between PP22 and PP23. There are special rules governing movement and supply and terrain combat between these two squares. Observe the dark black lines that run along the hex edge. That's the border between the Axis and the Soviets, the border at the start of the game. I've marked each of the dark black edges with a little red arrow so you can see, yes, that is the international border. There are some other borders that are not Axis-Soviet borders that separate Hungary from the land to the north, from Romania, between Romania and Bulgaria, and between Bulgaria and Greece. North of Hungary is Poland. At this stage in the war, that was the general government, and East Prussia, but there is a border line missing, and you can't actually tell where the border between Poland and East Prussia is. Note the dark circle indicated by the red arrow. This is a minor city. This one is Nikolaev. Minor cities are there for decorative purposes. They play no actual role in the game. There are no rules giving them any particular property, but there are a certain number of minor cities that are indicated so you can tell where they are. Now we come to the movement rules. A representative move is shown here for the 2-3-6. In the representative move, if you examine the map board, you find the 2-3-6 starts here. It has a movement factor of 6, meaning that if it is moving over clear terrain, that's what you have here, in good weather, it can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Movement in hex and counter board games is very much not like chess. First, on a player turn during the movement phase, the player can move any or all of his or her units up to the limits of their movement factor, there's some restraints. Terrain restricts movement. Zones of control, we'll get to them in a bit, restrict movement. It may be that a particular unit has no legal moves available for it, but in general, every unit is allowed to move. Moves do not have to be in straight lines. They can be irregular, as seen here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This unit has moved in much, but not quite completely, a circle. The number of squares a unit can move using normal movement, which is what we're seeing here, is determined by the movement factor. For this unit, that's a 6. For infantry and some other types of basically only infantry, the movement factor is a 4, so the unit can't move as far. Each unit has its own basic turn allowance, the number of movement points it has, its movement factor. You can't store movement points from turn to turn. On the indicated turn, the 2, 3, 6 could move up to 6 squares. On the next turn, it would have a fresh 6 movement points available, but if on this turn the 2, 3, 6 had only moved 1, 2, 3, on its next turn it would have 6 movement points available, not 9. Also, if this 2, 3, 6 only moved, say, 3 movement points up to square Z27 here, and then stopped, it couldn't loan or give its movement points to another unit. Each unit has its own basic allowance for the turn of movement points. That's all it has. That's all it gets to use when it's moving. There are some interesting features of movement that are not at all the same as chess or checkers or Go. One of them is stacking. You see on this square an 886, a 776, and a 776. Those 3 units are all occupying this same square, which, if you compare carefully with the label at the bottom, is square EE18. You are allowed to place up to 3 of your own units in one square. And that's what we have here. Placing multiple units on the same square is called stacking, and you see here a stack of units. We now come to one of the brilliant innovations of Charles Roberts. When Charles Roberts created the original board war games, modern board war games, Tactics and Tactics 2, he had to innovate to create a variety of effects that otherwise would have been hard to understand. One of them is the zone of control. The fundamental rationale between the zone of control and the map board is that if we have a military unit, it can concentrate and have its neighbors concentrated with it, that's stacking, or it can spread out and have defensive lines that cover an extensive piece of the map. The way we do this is that we have the unit. In this case, the unit is a 444. It's on square L45. And it has 6 adjoining squares, K45, K46, L46, M45, M44, and L44. These 6 adjoining squares are each marked with a red star. Those 6 red stars indicate the zone of control of this 444. In terms of real life, the zone of control represents the space that the 444 is partially spread out across. It doesn't represent the range over which the weapons can shoot. The squares here are a considerable number of miles across. If we imagine the combat units on this square firing that way is due to the top of the map, the range of fire would take even artillery shells only a modest distance into the next square. But that's not what the zone of control is. The zone of control represents the fact that the infantry and artillery and tanks and all this other good stuff of this unit can be spread out over a fair distance. Zones of control are important because they affect movement, they affect combat, and they can affect supply. Understanding the effects of zone of control and how they determine combat leads us to all of the tactical complexities of the Stalingrad game. Here, next to each other, are some German and Russian units, and we will now show the effect of zone of control. What is the basic issue? If the Russian 7-10-4 had started out in the upper left corner of the map, it could have moved, say, first to square L47 and then to square L46. But when it entered square L46, it would have entered the zone of control of the German 6th Infantry, and it would have had to stop moving and go no further. That's the first effect of zone of control. If you enter the zone of control of an enemy unit, you have to stop. What happens if you start in the zone of control of an enemy unit? The green lines indicate allowed moves, the red lines indicate forbidden moves. A unit that starts out, in this case we're talking about the 28th Infantry, the Russian 7-10-4, starting in the zone of control of the German 6th Infantry, this 4-4-4 below it. If the unit starts in the zone of control, it can move straight out of the zone of control and then keep on going. It can move out of the zone of control of a unit and then back into the zone of control of the unit at a different point. The 28th could move out of the zone of control of the 4-4-4, which it has now done. It's 2 squares away. And then crosswise and back into the zone of control of a second unit. The 28th is also allowed to move directly from the zone of control of the 6th Infantry out of the zone of control of the 6th Infantry, that's over up to here, M46, directly into the zone of control of the 4 Infantry, the other German 4-4-4. But when the 28th Infantry enters the zone of control of the 2nd German unit, it must immediately stop. On the other hand, there are a series of illegal moves indicated by the red lines. This unit started in the zone of control of this German unit. It can't move straight from one square in the zone of control of that unit over to another square in the zone of control of the same unit. The Russian unit is also not allowed to move directly on top of the German unit, no matter whether it stops, as indicated by the first red line, or moves out the first side, as indicated by the second red line. You can't move through a square occupied by an enemy unit. Finally, the 28th Infantry can't move the line going diagonally down and to the right, the red line, because when it starts here, its initial location, and moves on to its first square, it would have moved directly from one square in the zone of control of a unit into another square in the zone of control of the same unit. The next square of movement from M45 to N44 is also illegal. It's illegal because the Russian unit would be moving directly from M45, which is in the zone of control of the 4 Infantry, into N44, which is also in the zone of control of the 4 Infantry. So there are legal moves out of a zone of control and then back in, and there are illegal moves straight through. And now you have seen how zone of control affects movement. Units may use railroads to increase how far they can move. The general rule is that a unit may move onto a rail square, or it could start on a rail square. It may then, at any point in its move, choose to move up to 10 squares along the railroad, and its move along the railroad for up to 10 squares does not count against its basic turn allowance. It's a not normal movement, it's the rail bonus. Units are not required to take rail movement when they first move on to the railroad. So, for example, this German unit could move 1, 2 squares to this location, and having reached a railroad, it could then move along the railroad using the rail bonus, the blue line. Units are not required to use rail bonus at all. If they start on or move on to a rail square, they may use normal movement. Restriction on rail movement. The restriction on rail movement is that you must use the rail movement all in a single piece. This Russian unit would not be allowed to move here. Well, that part's legal. Move by railroad to this square, K40, that part would be legal. And now the illegal piece, move using normal movement to L39 and then take more squares from its rail bonus to get to L38. That would be illegal because the Russian unit would be splitting its rail move into 2 parts. What it would have to do to get to L38 using rail movement is to move onto the railroad, use rail movement along here, up into Vologda and then south. That move would be legal. Rough terrain, swamps or mountains, block movement. The German 886 here is allowed to move into the swamp. However, so soon as you move a unit onto a rough terrain square, unless there are railroads involved, the unit must stop. It may then move through the rough terrain at 1 square per turn until it gets to the far side. If the German 886 were moving the other way, from AA20 to AA19 would be a turn, to AA18 would be a second turn, and once the German unit is on a rough terrain square adjoining clear terrain, it would be allowed to move onto the clear terrain square at a cost of 1 movement point and continue its move normally. Railroads modify movement through rough terrain. A unit moving along a railroad is allowed to ignore the rough terrain limit. Thus, for example, the 696 seen here could move 1 square onto the square II10, as indicated. That's the first bit of the green line. It could then move parallel to the railroad to II11, to JJ11, to JJ12, and then off onto JJ13. It could take these extra moves because it moved onto a railroad. Alternatively, it could have started on a railroad, and it is then moving, crossing the hex edge between 2 rough terrain squares here, II10 and II11, by moving along the railroad. However, if the unit wants to take advantage of the railroad to ignore the rough terrain, it has to move parallel to the railroad. So the 696 that starts in the lower left of square bit of the map could move over here. It could move off along the railroad into clear terrain, JJ9. It could move along the railroad onto II11, but it would not, the red line labeled 1, it would not be legal for the unit to move directly onto JJ10 because it would have moved effectively across 2 rough terrain hex edges without benefit of railroad. Similarly, the point marked 2, the unit could, the 696, having moved by rail following the railroad to II11, could not move on to HH12 because now it would have crossed 2 rough terrain hex edges that are not crossed by a railroad in the same turn. Ditto, if the unit had reached JJ12, it could not then move on to II13 directly because that move is basically the same as the move leading to point 1, except there's some extra squares in the way. Having reached this point, the unit has already crossed one rough terrain hex edge that is not crossed by a railroad. It can't cross another one, so it must move to JJ13 if it wants to keep moving. We now look at several seasonal issues. The first seasonal issue, not shown in the image, refers to the country of Hungary. Hungary was neutral at the start of the war. No units, German Allied or Russian, can move into Hungary, advance into Hungary, or retreat into Hungary on the first turn of the game. They can only enter Hungary on the second turn of the game. Suppose, however, we reach fall, spring, winter. Sometimes the weather's perfect. Sometimes there's mud, and sometimes there's snow. In the winter months, it's always snowy. In the 4 fall and spring months, there are all sorts of possibilities. If the weather is mud, the normal move of a unit is cut in half. So as we see here, the 334 can only move through 2 clear terrain squares. The 696 can only move through 3 terrain squares. In snow, normal movement is affected in the same way. Units can't move as far as they could normally. Furthermore, in snowy weather, the railroad bonus is cut in half from 10 squares to 5 squares. As a result, this 696 in perfect weather could move 16 squares if it had full benefit of the rail bonus. But in snow, because the rail and normal movement are both cut in half, the 696 could only move through 8 squares. Snow also has a few extra effects. There are 4 river lines, well, one river is Y, in the northern part of the map. The Luga, the Volkhov, the Kolp, the northern Dvina. These rivers freeze in winter and cease to have any effect on combat. The swamps in the northern part of the map freeze and have no effect on movement. The lakes in the northern part of the map, that includes the ocean squares near Archangel, those lakes all freeze solid and become passable clear terrain, with one minor qualification. If you have a unit parked on one of those squares, and we advance from snow to mud or perfect weather, the lakes melt, and the units parked on those lakes sink into the waters and are lost forever. Having said all this, we now move from the discussion of movement, that's chapter 6 of my book, to chapter 7, the discussion of combat. Units have combat when they are moved into adjacent squares. So, for example, as seen here, at the start of the turn, this is the Russian player turn. At the start of the Russian turn, there was a German unit here. The Russian player moved 3 of her units, 3 4 6 4s, onto this square, the tail of the arrow. The 3 Russian units are all in the zone of control of the German unit, and vice versa, of course, and therefore the 3 Russian units are attacking the German unit. How do we tell who is the attacker and who is the defender? The player whose turn it is always the attacker. So on the German turns, the German half of the complete turn, the German is the attacker, and on the Russian half of the complete turn, the Russian player is the attacker. The other player, the player whose turn it is not, is the defender. What do we actually do when combat is occurring? Combat occurs during the battle phase of the game. All of the units that are next to enemy units are involved in some battle. We split combat up into battles which only can involve adjacent units. And having done this, we first calculate the combat odds. So we have 4 plus 4 plus 4, or 12 attack factors of Russians, attacking 4 defense factors of German. That is a 12-4 or 3-1. Having determined the combat odds, I'll discuss how this is done in a bit. We roll a die and we consult a combat results table. There will be a combat results table in a minute. The combat results table shows the possible combat odds as vertical columns, the die rolls as horizontal rows. You cross-index the two and you discover what the outcome of the battle is. And we have now moved to the point where the players of the game can't actually see in fine detail what is going on. So there's some random outcome, because, at least from the player's point of view, they've tried to arrange things favorably, but it is now not up to them which side wins. Let's look in more detail at the actual rules. I'm showing here an example. There are 2 Romanian units and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 Russian units. It's the Russian turn. The Russian has somehow attained the indicated position. The rule is that every unit that is in the zone of control of an enemy unit must participate in a battle. But it may only participate in one battle. You are allowed to have several of your units attack one enemy unit. You are allowed, if you are the attacker, to have one of your units attack several enemy units, but when you divide the combat into battles, it must be the case, it's a rules requirement, that every unit that is in the zone of control of an enemy unit must be in some battle, either as an attacker or defender. Now let's look at this attack example and see what it means. These 2 units, the 37 and the 64, are in the zone of control of the R/5, so they must make an attack. They can only attack the R/5, so these 2 units must be attacking this Romanian. Ditto, this 7-10-4, the 28th, is in the zone of control of the R/11, so it must be attacking the R/11. There are, however, 2 other Russian units on the map, the 3 infantry and the 36th infantry. Those 2 units are in the zone of control of both Romanian units. Now you might say, well, could we fight this all as one big battle, the 5 Russians against the 2 German allies? And the answer is no, because this Soviet unit, the 28th, is not in the zone of control of the R/5, so it can't attack the R/5. These 2 Soviet units are not in the zone of control of the R/11, so they can't attack the R/11. And therefore, since we have 3 units that only can attack one of the 2 Romanian units, we must have 2 battles. The blue wavy line indicates the split into 2 battles. Well, if there must be 2 battles, what is the fate of the 3 and the 36? And the answer is that the Russian player gets to decide what to do with her units, and she may assign either or both of these 2 units to attack one Romanian or to attack the other Romanian. That's up to her. The attacker gets to decide when there's more than one possible outcome. Here's a slightly different case. We have this time all 5 Russian units and both German allied units. They're all in each other's zone of control. This time, however, every single Russian unit is in the zone of control of both German units. And therefore, every single Russian unit could attack both German units at the same time in one big battle. Now, you might say, well, could all 5 units attack one of the 2 Romanians and ignore the other? And the answer is no. Both Romanian units are in the zone of control of some German unit, and therefore both Romanian units must be attacked in some battle. This could be fought as one big battle, 5 Russian units attacking 2 Romanian units, or 2 smaller battles. where some of the Russian units attack one Romanian and some of the Russian units attack the other Romanian. There's no requirement that all of the units in a stack attack the same way. So, for example, the two 7-10 4s and one of these 5-7 4s could attack one of the Romanians, and one 5-7 4 and a second 5-7 4 in the other stack could attack the other Romanian. I didn't say that was the best possible choice for the German, Russian I mean. I'm saying it's a legal choice. There are, however, a couple of other restrictions on combat. First of all, the attacker may never voluntarily have one of her units attack at odds worse than 1 to 6, say 1 to 7. If there is a way to arrange the attacks, that is how we split the combat into individual battles, so that there are no attacks at worse than 1 to 6, that split must be used. If there is no way to arrange things so that there is an attack at 1 to 7 or worse, if you can't rig things so you don't have units attacking at 1 to 7, the units attacking at 1 to 7 or worse are removed from the map at the start of the battle phase. They don't affect combat, and they don't affect the requirement that every unit adjacent to an enemy unit must be involved in battle. The other exception involves the Straits of Azov, the Kerch Straits. There is no combat allowed across the Kerch Straits. A German unit and a Russian unit on opposite sides of the straits just sit there and stare at each other. They can't move across the straits because you can't move onto an enemy unit. They can't attack across the straits. They could run supply lines. We'll come to those in a bit across the straits. To move across the Kerch Straits, that's a very slow process. On the first turn, a unit moves to one side of the straits. On the next turn, it is allowed to move one square to the far side of the straits and stop. On the next turn after that, it is either allowed to keep moving inland, or it is allowed to turn around and move backwards across the Kerch Straits, in which case it moves across the straits and stops again. So, I've now described how you split units into battles. Having done that, the next step is to calculate the combat odds ratio for each battle. The way you do this is to sum the attack factors of all of the attacking units in a battle, and to sum the defense factors of all of the defending units in the battle. It is possibly, but not necessarily, the case that the defender has some or all of her units doubled in defense, so what appears to be a 4-6-4 will be defending with a defense factor of 12. You now have two numbers, the total attack factor A and the total defense factor D. Either A or D is smaller. If A and D are equal, the combat ratio is a 1 to 1. Otherwise, you take the smaller of the two numbers A and D and divide it into both numbers. Suppose D is smaller. In that case, you divide D by D and you get 1. You divide A by D and you get some fraction which is larger than 1. Because the A is larger, you truncate the A. So, for example, if your ratio is 2.95 to 1, the reduction is 2 to 1. Let's consider some examples. 10 to 2 becomes 10 over 2 to 2 over 2, or 5 to 1. 60 to 20 becomes 60 over 20 to 20 over 20, or 3 to 1. However, we truncate. 59 to 20 becomes 59 twentieths to 20 twentieths, or 2.95 to 1, which truncates to 2 to 1. If the defenders outnumber the attackers, divide A and D by A. Of course, A over A is 1. Round D over A upwards. So 10 to 20, 10 attack factors to 20 defense factors becomes 10 tenths to 20 tenths, or 1 to 2. 19 to 20 becomes 19 nineteenths to 20 nineteenths, or 1 to 1.06, and 1.06 rounds upwards to 2, so a 20 to 21 is a 1 to 2. Notice that no matter whether A or D is the smaller number, the smaller is reduced to a 1, and the larger number is truncated or rounded up to the next integer. One says that the larger number has been changed in favor of the defender, and in fact, once upon a time there was a cute gadget, a slide rule CRT, which was a cardboard analog computer that let you determine the odds if you couldn't handle division. This worked better when anyone had ever seen a slide rule before, but they still exist. They're still in old copies of the game. Okay, so we are going to have combat. What happens during combat? Well, some units are eliminated. They're removed from the board. The units that are removed from the board are placed into a dead pile. It's a stack of units that are dead. Each player has a dead pile. The destroyed units of each player go in the corresponding player's dead pile. You're always allowed to look at the dead pile to see which units have been eliminated. Traditionally, in face-to-face play, the dead piles are dropped in the Black Sea, which is convenient for everyone. What are the combat results? A elim, attacker eliminated. The attacker's units are destroyed. D elim, defender eliminated. The defender's units are destroyed. They go into the defender's dead pile. A back 2, attacker back 2. All units in the battle that belong to the attacker are retreated 2 squares. The defender decides where they're going, not necessarily nicely. There are special rules for retreats. D back 2, defender back 2. All units in the battle belonging to the defender are retreated 2 squares. The attacker decides where they go. There are a couple of special rules governing retreats. First, retreats are not movement. Rough terrain does not slow a retreat down. You can retreat 2 squares through mountains. Furthermore, since having said you can retreat through mountains, you don't have to be retreated in a straight line. So, for example, a retreating unit could be retreated in a V and end up 1 square away from where it started. There is one other combat result. It is the exchange. In an exchange, the weaker side, the side with the fewer attack factors as adjusted for terrain in the battle, loses all of its units. The other side must lose at least as many attack factors. If the other side cannot make exact change, it may have to lose even more attack factors. Let's consider some examples. We have some battles here. In A, the 2 Russians, say it's the Russian move, 5 plus 5 equals 10, are attacking the Romanian. That's a 10 to 2 or 5 to 1. Over here, we could say that 4, 8, 12, 16, 19 factors of Germans are attacking 20 factors of Russians. That's a 1 to 2. We could also say that 4, 8, 11 factors of Germans, these 3 units, are attacking one of the Russians. That's a 12 to 10 or 1 to 1. And the other 2 Germans, 4 plus 4 attack factors to 10, are making an 8 to 10 or 1 to 2. Now suppose as a result of battles, we might have retreats. Or it might be that the Russians are attacking and they're going to throw the Germans back. You cannot retreat through an enemy unit. You cannot retreat across a coast into water. You cannot retreat off the edge of the board. And you cannot retreat into an enemy zone of control. So the R/11 has this little problem. It can't retreat onto the 2, 5, 7, 4s. It can't retreat to the squares on either side of them because they're both in this 5, 7, 4's zone of control. It can't retreat to over here. That's a water square. It can't retreat due backwards. That's the edge of the board. And it can't retreat to V14, the square here, because that square is in the zone of control. Well, it could retreat to V14, that's all right, but the retreat is back 2, and the second square of the retreat would have to be either W14, can't go there, there's a Russian zone of control there, or V15, can't go there, there's a Russian zone of control there. So the R/11 has no retreat. The German 9th Infantry is in the same boat. It has no retreat. It can legally retreat here. That's a retreat of 1, but its second square of retreat would carry it into V15 or U15, squares in the zone of control of these Russians. That's not allowed, so this unit has no retreat. The two Russian units in the middle are surrounded. Every square adjacent to them is either occupied by a German unit or a German zone of control, so these units have no legal retreat, and if they get a D back 2, or if they're attacking an A back 2 result, they're eliminated instead and removed from the board. We now come to the issue of advance after combat. All these German units are attacking a single 4-6-4. The German units are all on river squares. If you look carefully, you can see the river. The Russian is not on a river square, so the Russian is doubled in defense. So the combat odds are all of these Germans, it's a lot, to this Russian, which is worth 6 doubled, or 12. For the sake of argument, suppose that this is a 4-to-1 attack. In that case, there is a 4-to-1. The Russian unit will either be eliminated, forced to retreat, or there will be an exchange, and the square occupied by the Russian unit that was doubled on defense becomes vacant. Because that square has become vacant, the German units are allowed to advance into the square occupied by the Russian unit. They can take that advance, they can ignore enemy zones of control while they're advancing. They can't ignore stacking limits. After the advance, you can't have a stack of Germans that's more than 3 units high. Suppose an exchange had been rolled. The Russian unit has only 8 attack factors, 4 but doubled because it's behind a river, to a whole pile of Germans, so the Russian unit is eliminated. It's worth 4 times 2 or 8 attack factors, and therefore, what we do not see here, the German would have had to remove at least 8 attack factors from these stacks before he took his advance. So in an exchange, both sides take casualties. We have now advanced to the point where we see a combat results table. The allowed combat odds are the vertical columns from 1 to 6 to 6 to 1. If an attack is made at 7 to 1 or higher odds, the outcome is always the same. The defender is eliminated during the battle phase. The combat odds table also has horizontal rows labeled 1 through 6, and those correspond to the 6 rolls of a 6-sided die. Suppose there's a 1-to-1 attack being made. Here's the 1-to-1 column. We roll a die and we look at the outcome, and the outcome we see is, for example, a DE. We've rolled a 1 on the die, so if we cross-index the 1 row with the 1-to-1 column, we see a DE, a defender eliminated. If we'd instead rolled a 3, we see a D2, a defender back 2. And you have now seen, approximately speaking, how the combat odds table is used. There are some interesting bits of structure in the combat results table. At odds of 1 to 3 or less, worse, the only possible results are attacker back 2 and attacker eliminated. The attacker never wins. At odds of 3 to 1 or greater, the only results are exchange, D back 2, and D elim. The defender is always either shoved off the square or destroyed. In between, all sorts of things can happen. The highest odds at which there is an attacker eliminated result is 2 to 1. There's the attacker eliminated. That becomes a defender eliminated at 3 to 1. At odds between 1 to 2 and 4 to 1 inclusive, the result exchange appears. If the attack is made at 5 to 1 or higher, the only possible combat results are D back 2 and D elim. So I've now shown you something of the structure of the combat results table. Using the combat results table and the rules for splitting combat into individual battles is a core part of tactical judgment in Stalingrad. You do these things, you make the arrangements, and you try to arrange things to be as favorable as possible for yourself.